In 2021, a team of geneticists sequenced DNA from 166 ancient skeletons scattered across East Asia, some of them almost 8,000 years old, and lined the results up next to genetic data from 46 living populations. The paper came out in Nature under the driest possible title, Genomic Insights into the Formation of Human Populations in East Asia. No pyramids in the headline, no pharaohs, just a quiet, careful reconstruction of where 1.4 billion people actually came from, and the answer it gave was stranger and better supported than almost anything you'll find on this topic on YouTube. Because here's the thing. If you search this subject online, you'll find dozens of videos claiming scientists compared Chinese DNA to every ancient civilization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and found no match anywhere except one obscure river valley in northern China. It's a great story. It's also not really how the actual research reads. Real population geneticists were never trying to prove that Chinese people are unrelated to Egyptians the way you're unrelated to your neighbor. Every human population on Earth is related, going back to the same handful of migrations out of Africa some 60,000 years ago. What the actual studies measure is something more specific and, honestly, more interesting. Not whether populations are connected at all, but how much of a person's ancestry right now traces back to a particular farming population that lived in a particular place at a particular time. And when you ask that question properly, using ancient DNA extracted directly from skeletons rather than guesswork, the answer for most of China really does point overwhelmingly to one place, just not for the reasons, or with the tidy, suspiciously round percentages that the clickbait versions claim. So let's do this properly. Let's look at what the real research says, who did it, how they did it, and what it actually tells us about 7,000 years of continuous human history in one of the least understood corners of the ancient world. Start with the method, because the method is the whole story. Ancient DNA research used to be nearly impossible. DNA degrades, it fragments, it gets contaminated by bacteria, by the archaeologists who excavated it, by everyone who touched the bone before it got to a lab. For most of the 20th century, geneticists trying to study ancestry had to work backward from living people, comparing DNA between modern populations and inferring what must have happened in the past. That approach has serious limits. It can tell you two populations share ancestry, but it struggles to tell you when the mixing happened, in which direction, or what the people actually looked like genetically before more recent history scrambled everything. The breakthrough came from a mix of new sequencing technology and painstaking lab technique. Clean rooms, UV-sterilized tools, sampling from the dense petrous bone behind the ear where DNA survives best. Labs like David Reich's at Harvard, working with Chinese collaborators primarily based at Fudan University in Shanghai and institutions like Jilin University and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, started pulling usable genomes directly out of skeletons that were thousands of years old. That's the real shift. Instead of guessing what ancient populations looked like genetically, researchers could now just read their DNA directly from the actual people who lived and died in the Yellow River Valley, the Yangtze Basin, the Tibetan plateau, and the deserts of Xinjiang. The 2021 Nature study, led by Wang along with Reich and dozens of co-authors, sequenced genome-wide data from 166 ancient East Asians dating between roughly 6,000 BCE and 1,000 CE, and compared them against 46 present-day populations. This is the paper most of the China DNA mystery videos are loosely and inaccurately describing when they talk about a mysterious Fudan University study. It's real. It's just not about ruling out Egypt. It's about mapping, region by region, which ancient population contributed, how much ancestry to which modern group. And what it found, stated carefully, goes like this. Farmers from the Yellow River Basin, going back to around 3000 BCE, so 5,000 years ago in the late Neolithic, carried a genetic signature that shows up in dramatically different concentrations all over East Asia today. In the Central Plain, the heartland of what would eventually become dynastic China, that Yellow River farmer ancestry accounts for somewhere between 59 and 84% of the genome of modern Han Chinese populations, depending on the specific groups and regions sampled. Further out, on the Tibetan plateau, groups descended from a related population carry as much as 84% of that same ancestral signal. The researchers argue this ancestry likely tracks the early spread of Sino-Tibetan languages, the family that includes both Mandarin and Tibetan, radiating outward from a shared point of origin in the Yellow River region. That's the real headline. Not one civilization matched and all the others failed, but something more precise. A specific Neolithic farming population, definable by direct ancient DNA, contributed the majority, sometimes the overwhelming majority, of ancestry to hundreds of millions of people living across an enormous stretch of Asia today. That's still an extraordinary finding. It just doesn't need exaggeration to be extraordinary. Now, who were these people, actually, before they were a genetic statistic? The Yellow River Basin in northern China has been home to farming societies for an extremely long time. Millet cultivation there goes back roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years at sites like Sichuan and Piligang, making it one of the handful of places on Earth where agriculture was invented independently rather than borrowed from somewhere else. By around 7,000 years ago, communities belonging to what archaeologists call the Yangzhou culture were living in substantial planned villages. Banpo, one of the best excavated Yangzhou sites near modern Xi'an, shows circular house foundations, storage pits, a surrounding defensive ditch, kilns for firing pottery, and burial grounds with grave goods that suggest an organized, stratified society rather than a loose collection of huts. Their pottery is famous for bold, painted geometric and animal designs, some of the earliest deliberate decorative art in East Asian prehistory. It's worth being precise here about something the popular videos routinely get wrong. The earliest confirmed Chinese writing, the oracle bone inscriptions used for divination, doesn't come from this early Yellow River farming culture at all. It comes from the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years later, around 1200 BCE. There are earlier isolated marks on Yangzhou and Longshan pottery that some researchers consider possible precursors to writing, but there's no scholarly consensus that these constitute a developed script. Getting the timeline right matters, because the actual story doesn't need the writing system moved up by 4,000 years to be impressive. A population inventing agriculture independently, building organized villages, and producing distinctive art 7,000 years ago is already remarkable on its own terms. Genetically, the people uncovered at sites connected to this Yellow River farming tradition are the ancestral population of the 2021 study, and its follow-ups keep tracing forward through time. And more recent excavation work has pushed the picture even further. A 2024 paper in Current Biology, again out of Fudan and collaborating institutions, sequenced dozens of ancient individuals from Shandong province in the lower Yellow River Valley and traced continuous genetic threads from the early Neolithic straight through into the historical period. A separate 2025 study looked specifically at newly sequenced genomes from Han Dynasty burial sites in Shandong and found what the authors describe as strong genetic continuity with the earlier millet farming societies of the Middle Yellow River, layered with only minor influence from southern rice farming populations. In plain terms, people living in that region during one of China's first great imperial dynasties were, genetically, still recognizably descended from Neolithic farmers who lived in roughly the same area thousands of years earlier. Meanwhile, a genuinely separate population was developing along the Yangtze River to the south, and their story doesn't get nearly enough attention. Rice, not millet, was their foundation crop, domesticated independently in the Yangtze Basin around the same deep timescale as northern millet farming. Current evidence puts early rice cultivation there at roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. The site of Hemudu, dated to around 7,000 years ago, is spectacular. Waterlogged conditions, preserved wooden pile-dwelling houses built up on stilts above wet paddies, along with wooden tools, woven textiles, and elaborately carved objects, including bone and ivory pieces decorated with what look like sun and bird motifs. This was a genuinely distinct cultural and genetic lineage from the Yellow River farmers to the north, adapted to a completely different environment and subsistence strategy. For a long stretch of prehistory, these were two separate worlds, developing agriculture, technology, and social organization in parallel, without one simply copying the other. That in itself is one of the more quietly remarkable facts in all of world archaeology. China didn't have one point of civilizational origin, it had at least two, arising independently within the same broad region and eventually merging. Because merge is exactly what happened. Starting around 5,000 years ago and accelerating through the Bronze Age, Yellow River populations expanded outward, south toward the Yangtze, west toward the Tibetan plateau and Sichuan Basin, and eventually further afield. The genetic evidence shows this wasn't a simple story of one group erasing another. A 2025 ancient genome study looking at burial sites from the Song through Qing dynasties along the lower Yangtze, spanning roughly 960 to 1921 CE, found that most individuals sampled derived somewhere between about 69 and 100% of their ancestry from populations related to the ancient Yellow River farmers, with the remainder coming from an older southern Yangtze-associated genetic substrate. The researchers describe modern Han Chinese living in that same region today as being directly, traceably descended from those historical individuals. So the picture in the south isn't erasure, and it isn't an even 50-50 blend either. It's a gradient, expansion layered onto an existing population, with the newer northern-derived ancestry ending up dominant almost everywhere it reached, but rarely total. The same expand and absorb pattern shows up again on the Tibetan plateau, and this is where the genetics gets genuinely strange in the best way. Modern Tibetan populations carry a very large share of that same Yellow River, more closely related, Sino-Tibetan associated ancestry, which is part of why linguists and geneticists increasingly think Mandarin and Tibetan really do share a common linguistic ancestor, tracing back to farmers in that same general region roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But Tibetans also carry something northern lowland Chinese populations essentially don't have, a gene variant called EPAS1 that allows their bodies to handle the brutally thin air above 4,000 meters without the dangerous overproduction of red blood cells that afflicts most lowlanders who move to altitude. In 2014, a study in Nature examined the DNA sequence around that gene in Tibetan and hand samples and found something nobody expected. The specific version of EPAS1 that gives Tibetans their altitude tolerance doesn't match anything found in other modern human populations. It matches Denisovans, an extinct human relative known mainly from a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave, and, as later research would show, from populations that lived across parts of Asia at high elevations. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of modern Tibetans interbred with Denisovans, or a population closely related to them, and inherited a piece of DNA that generations later would let their descendants live and farm and raise families in conditions that would slowly poison most other humans. It's one of the best documented cases anywhere in human genetics of a trait passed down not from our own species, but borrowed from a cousin species that no longer exists. When the Yellow River descended, farmers eventually pushed onto the plateau. They weren't just meeting another group of humans. They were meeting populations who already carried an ancient adaptation gifted to them by a completely different kind of human being. Now, contrast all of this with what was happening in Europe over roughly the same time frame, because the difference is genuinely striking. And it's the part of this story that best explains why China's genetic record looks the way it does. Starting around 5,000 years ago, pastoralist groups from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, broadly associated with the Yamnaya culture, began moving west into Europe in large numbers, bringing new technologies, new burial customs, and, it turns out, an enormous amount of new ancestry. A landmark 2018 study in Nature, led by Inigo Olalde, working with David Reich's lab, examined genome-wide data from 400 Neolithic, Copper Age, and Bronze Age individuals across Europe, including over 200 associated with the so-called Bell Beaker archaeological culture. In most of continental Europe, the Beaker culture appears to have spread mainly as an idea, pottery styles and burial customs moving between populations without much large-scale movement of actual people. But in Britain, the pattern was completely different. The arrival of Beaker-associated migrants there was linked to the replacement of roughly 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool within just a few hundred years. 90%. That's not gradual admixture. That's close to a wholesale population turnover, with the male lineage carried in almost entirely by newcomers. So, when you line the two regions up side by side, the contrast becomes the real story, arguably more interesting than either case on its own. Bronze Age. Britain experienced something close to total demographic replacement in a few centuries. Bronze Age and Iron Age China, by comparison, mostly experienced expansion and layered mixing, a founding population growing outward, absorbing neighboring groups through intermarriage and cultural assimilation, rather than displacing them outright, region after region ending up with a gradient of ancestry rather than a clean break. Geneticists studying Han Dynasty and Shang Dynasty remains have found genetic profiles broadly continuous with populations living in the same regions today, even after more than 3,000 years and multiple dynastic collapses, foreign conquests, and civil wars. That kind of long-run population stability isn't unique to China. Several regions of the world show comparable continuity where geography or agricultural density limited outside disruption. But it stands in real, well-documented contrast to what ancient DNA shows happened across large parts of Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. Why the difference? Nobody claims a single tidy explanation, but a few contributing factors show up consistently in the archaeological and genetic literature. Geography is one. The Yellow River Basin sits behind the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau to the southwest, the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts to the northwest, and the Pacific to the east. Not an impenetrable fortress by any means, since plenty of invasions and migrations did reach it, but enough of a barrier to slow the kind of rapid, large-scale steppe migration that repeatedly swept across the more open terrain of the Eurasian steppe corridor into Europe. Population density is another. Intensive millet and rice agriculture could support very large numbers of people per square kilometer compared to the pastoralist economies of the steppe, and dense agricultural populations are demographically much harder to displace or genetically overwhelm than thinly spread groups. And cultural mechanisms mattered too. A shared writing system that stayed legible across enormous regional dialect differences, and later a civil examination system that gave outside elites, including conquering Mongol and Manchu ruling families, strong incentives to intermarry and assimilate into existing Chinese culture rather than replace it. Even the Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century and the Manchu conquest in the 17th, each of which put a foreign dynasty on the throne for generations, left comparatively modest genetic traces in the wider population, precisely because assimilation, not replacement, was how those conquests eventually resolved themselves. There's a second, independent line of evidence worth walking through, because it comes at the same question from a completely different angle, and it happens to confirm the River Valley picture in a way that's hard to dismiss as a fluke. Everything discussed so far comes from nuclear DNA, the genome you inherit as a shuffled mix from both parents. But there's another kind of DNA that follows a much simpler rule, mitochondrial DNA, passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along a single unbroken maternal line. Because it doesn't get reshuffled the way nuclear DNA does, mitochondrial DNA is especially good at preserving deep signals of ancient population history. And it's been mapped extensively across Chinese populations for exactly that reason. A 2019 study published in Molecular Biology and Evolution analyzed close to 5,000 mitochondrial genomes from Han Chinese individuals across the country, including over 200 newly sequenced for the project. And it found something that lines up strikingly well with the nuclear DNA story. Populations clustered not primarily by province or by modern administrative boundary, but by which of China's three great river systems they came from: the Yellow River, the Yangtze, and the Pearl River, known in Chinese as the Xinjiang. Each river valley showed a distinct signature carried through specific maternal lineages, one grouping called haplogroup D4, concentrated in the north, another B4, more common along the Yangtze, and a third M7, especially frequent in the deep south, showing up in around a third of samples from Guangxi province, compared with roughly 1 in 7 in Shanghai, further north along the Yangtze corridor. When the researchers calculated how old these maternal lineages were, using mutation rate methods, they landed on age estimates stretching back tens of thousands of years, with more recent subbranches showing signs of rapid, more localized expansion that lines up neatly with the early Neolithic period across the region, the same window in which the Yellow River and Yangtze farming traditions were first getting established. In other words, two entirely separate genetic systems, one inherited biparentally, one inherited only through mothers, sampled by two different research teams using different methods and different sets of ancient and modern individuals, both point to the same underlying structure. Ancient river valleys, not modern provinces, not even modern ethnic categories, are still the deepest, most durable fault lines running through Chinese population genetics. That kind of independent convergence between different types of evidence is exactly what gives geneticists confidence that they're looking at a real historical signal rather than a statistical artifact of how one particular study happened to be designed. It's also worth pausing on why the exaggerated one civilization defeats all the others version of this story spreads as easily as it does. Real papers like the ones just described are dense, technical, and hedge their conclusions carefully. Phrases like estimated ancestry proportions and modeled admixture don't translate well into an attention-grabbing thumbnail. It's a much shorter leap, narratively, to compress a specific Neolithic population contributed the majority of ancestry to a specific modern group into scientists proved ancient Egypt has nothing to do with China, even though the second claim isn't really what any of these papers set out to test in the first place. The genuine science doesn't need that kind of inflation. If anything, the real findings are more interesting precisely because they're more specific. A farming population in a particular valley, dated to a particular millennium, whose descendants can be traced forward through burial sites from the Neolithic all the way to the Han and Tang dynasties, and from there into the DNA of people alive right now. There's one more twist in this story, and it comes from the part of China you'd least expect. The deserts of Xinjiang in the far northwest, about as far from the Yellow River as you can get and still be inside the modern country's borders. For decades, archaeologists knew about a set of extraordinarily well-preserved mummies pulled from the Tarim Basin, dating back roughly 4,000 years, naturally desiccated by the region's extreme aridity and salty soil, rather than deliberately embalmed. What made them famous and controversial was their appearance. Tall individuals, some with reddish or light-colored hair, dressed in woven wool clothing that some researchers thought looked more Central Asian or even European than East Asian. For years, competing theories placed their origins with migrating herders from the Russian steppe, oasis farmers with roots on the Iranian plateau, or corridor cultures further west. It became one of the more genuinely contested questions in Eurasian archaeology. Then, in 2021, a team led by Fan Zhang and Chao Ning, working with labs across China, South Korea, and Germany, sequenced genome-wide data from 13 of the earliest Tarim mummies, dated to between roughly 2135 and 1623 BCE. and the results overturned every leading theory at once. These individuals carried around 72% ancient North Eurasian ancestry, a genetic component associated with a small, deeply diverged population of Ice Age hunter-gatherers whose legacy shows up today, in smaller doses, in populations as far apart as Native Americans and Northern Europeans, mixed with about 28% ancestry related to ancient populations of Northeast Asia. Critically, the study found no detectable ancestry from the steppe herders many researchers had assumed brought the mummies' ancestors into the region, and no strong genetic link to the oasis cultures further west either. Instead, these people appear to have descended from a genetically isolated local population that had likely lived in or near that same desert corridor since deep prehistory, adopting neighboring farming and pastoral practices, including wheat, barley, and even dairy cheese making, borrowed from cultures around them, while remaining a genetically distinct, largely self-contained group for an extraordinarily long time. Genetically isolated, but by no means culturally isolated, trading, adopting technologies, and absorbing outside ideas even while staying, generation after generation, a population apart. It's a strange, almost paradoxical finding, and it says something valuable about how careless the single ancestral source version of this story really is. China's population history isn't one clean line running from a single Neolithic village to 1.4 billion people today. It's several distinct ancient populations: Yellow River millet farmers, Yangtze rice farmers, Tibetan highlanders carrying a gene borrowed from an extinct human relative, and an isolated desert population in the far northwest, with no close genetic match to anyone around them, that expanded, mixed, and in some cases stayed remarkably separate across a landmass roughly the size of the continental United States for thousands of years. What the genuine research actually supports is something more interesting than a mystery-solved headline. It supports the idea that complex, literate, agricultural civilization did not require diffusion from a single point of origin somewhere in the Middle East, spreading outward to every other corner of the ancient world. East Asia developed its own independent farming traditions, millet in the north, rice in the south, thousands of years before anyone in that region had contact with societies in Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley. That's not a controversial claim requiring dramatic new DNA evidence to establish. Archaeologists have understood East Asian agriculture as an independent invention for decades. What the ancient DNA revolution has added is the ability to trace, with real precision, how the population descended from those independent farming traditions, expanded, mixed, and in places stayed remarkably stable, generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty, for thousands of years, through invasions, conquests, and collapses that reshaped the genetic map of large parts of the rest of the world. That's the actual discovery. Not a single ancient civilization winning a DNA contest against Egypt and Mesopotamia, but a slow, patient, and genuinely well-supported reconstruction of how hundreds of millions of people living today carry the genetic signature of farmers who were domesticating millet along a muddy river in northern China 9,000 years ago, while, a continent away, an entirely separate population in the deserts of the same modern country stayed almost untouched by any of it. The full story is stranger, more layered, and considerably better evidenced than the version built for a thumbnail. It just took actual scientists, working carefully with degraded bone fragments in clean rooms, a couple of decades to piece it together properly.